It was just after 11 p.m. on a quiet stretch of highway outside Birmingham, Alabama. Renee Dawson, a seasoned military officer, was on her way home after a long day. The road was empty, and the night seemed calm. That is, until the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror shattered the peace. What started as a simple traffic stop would quickly spiral into a confrontation that would change everything. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now to see how one woman's courage took down a man who thought his badge made him untouchable. Renee's hands gripped the steering wheel, her fingers tapping gently in rhythm with the jazz tune softly playing in the background. She was so close to home, just minutes away from unwinding after the long, exhausting drive. The soft hum of her car was like a lullaby, and for a moment she let herself relax. Just a moment of peace before the chaos of the world crept back in. Then, the flashing lights pierced the calm. Red, blue. The sudden brightness felt like a jolt to her system, as if a switch had been flipped from serenity to alert. She glanced at the rearview mirror, her stomach tightening, not out of fear, but exhaustion. The sound of the siren, distant at first, grew closer, its relentless wail gnawing at her nerves. She sighed, knowing exactly what was coming. Another routine stop. Another officer who would treat her like just another target on the road. Her car coasted to a stop, tires grinding against the wet asphalt. The low hum of the engine the only sound now. A white patrol car pulled up behind her. The officer didn't rush. He was deliberate, as if expecting her to cower before his presence. Renee's gaze stayed fixed on the rearview mirror, watching as the officer's silhouette grew larger with each step. When he finally reached her window, his uniform gleamed under the flashing lights, his badge glinting like a symbol of authority. Officer Daniel Briggs. The name flashed in her mind, a warning that only came with experience. He looked at her, eyes scanning the inside of her car like she was guilty of something. No greeting, no good evening. Just a flat, monotone license and registration. Renee kept her gaze steady, meeting his eyes through the mirror. Her voice came out calm, measured. "Was I speeding, officer?" For a moment, Briggs didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving hers, as if he were sizing her up. Then finally he spoke. His voice was cold, clipped. Taillights out. Renee's brow furrowed, her pulse quickening, but she stayed composed. "That can't be right, I just checked them a few weeks ago." A flicker of something crossed his face. Irritation, maybe? It was gone so quickly she couldn't quite place it. But then something in his tone shifted, and the tension in the air became tangible. "You arguing with me?" Her heart skipped a beat. She could feel the change in the atmosphere, the heavy, almost oppressive weight of power that hung between them. He expected her to back down, but Renee was no stranger to this kind of confrontation. She had spent years in the military, facing danger in foreign lands, enduring the unspoken pressures of being a woman in a man's world. She wasn't going to back down now, not for him. "I'm not arguing," she replied, her voice still even. "I'm just saying my taillights were checked recently, but if there's an issue, I'll get it fixed." His smirk deepened, and it hit her like a wave. He didn't hear her. He wasn't listening. He was pushing, testing her. He wanted control. Without warning, Briggs barked, "Step out of the car." Renee froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but she refused to let it show. No witnesses, no cameras. She glanced at the road ahead, the emptiness stretching for miles in both directions. A flash of cold air swept through her as she opened the door and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. Her muscles tensed, but her posture remained relaxed, composed. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wouldn't back down either. "Mind telling me why?" she asked, the words slipping from her mouth before she could stop them. Briggs didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing, a smirk still playing at the corners of his mouth. "Because I said so," he said, the words dripping with arrogance. Renee felt a surge of anger bubble up, but she pushed it down. She knew better than to engage in a power struggle with someone like him. But then he took another step closer, the space between them closing. his body language unmistakable. He wanted to intimidate her. Turn around, hands on the car. Her pulse quickened. No, this wasn't just about a broken tail light. This wasn't just about an officer doing his job. This was about control. Power. She had two choices: comply and fight this later, or stand her ground and risk escalation. She wasn't going to let this man dictate her fate. Why? She asked again, her voice quieter but still firm. Briggs didn't hesitate. Are you resisting? His words were a challenge, a taunt. But Renee wasn't playing his game. Her mind raced, but she kept her movements slow, deliberate. She placed her hands on the roof of her car, the cool metal grounding her. She wasn't resisting, but she wasn't submitting either. I need you to understand something, she said, her voice low but steady. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do. A flicker of annoyance flashed across his face, but it was quickly masked by that same smugness. You're under arrest, he snapped, reaching for her wrist. Renee moved before he could touch her, stepping back just enough to avoid his grip. Under arrest for what? Obstructing an officer, he said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Her eyes narrowed. That was it. Her military training kicked in, her mind racing through the possible outcomes. Comply and fight later, or stand tall and risk everything now. She wasn't about to become another statistic. With a deep breath, she placed her hands on the roof of her car, allowing him to cuff her, too tightly as if to make a point. She didn't flinch, didn't let him see the crack in her calm facade. But inside, something was shifting. This wasn't just about a taillight. It was about her, and she wasn't going to let him take hers. As Renee was thrust into the back of the patrol car, her wrists aching from the too tight cuffs. The world outside the small window seemed distant. The flashing lights outside reflected in the side mirror, but it felt as if she were already in another world, one where she was no longer in control. It was strange, almost surreal. She had been in combat situations where every second felt like life or death, but this was different. This was a man with a badge, someone who should have been upholding the law, not abusing it. But while Renee steeled herself, her thoughts turned to someone else. Officer Jenkins, an officer who had been on duty the same night and had been called in to back up Briggs. Jenkins was relatively new to the force, only a few years on the job, and unlike Briggs, he hadn't yet fully bought into the entitlement that came with the badge. But he had witnessed it. He had seen the way Briggs walked around like he was touchable. He'd seen the smirks, the condescending remarks, the way the other officers acted when they thought no one was watching. That night, when he was asked to back up Briggs, Jenkins didn't expect much. He knew Briggs had a reputation, but he didn't think he would actually witness something like this. When he saw Renee calmly refusing to back down, his gut twisted. He had seen people like her before, the ones who understood their rights, who didn't fold under pressure. But Renee wasn't just anyone. She was military, poised, unyielding. Jenkins had been silently rooting for her. He didn't know why. It wasn't like he could speak out against Briggs, not yet anyway. But there was something about the way Renee stood her ground that made Jenkins realize just how out of line his partner was. And when Briggs placed those cuffs too tightly on her wrists, Jenkins felt a knot form in his stomach. It wasn't right. It wasn't just the law. It was basic decency. He glanced over at Briggs as the patrol car pulled away, the arrogant smirk still plastered on his face. It was almost as if he believed Renee had been asking for it, asking for the harsh treatment she was receiving. Jenkins wanted to speak up, to say something, anything, but he knew better than to challenge Briggs directly. Not yet. The system was built to protect men like him. And right now, Jenkins was just a rookie with too many debts to pay. But still, something gnawed at him. What if it was his mother? What if it was someone he cared about in that situation? Would he just stand by and watch? The thought made his stomach turn. It was easy to tell yourself you were just doing your job, but it wasn't the job that bothered him. It was the way Briggs had spoken to Renee, the way he treated her like a criminal just for standing up for herself. He couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. The drive to the station was silent, except for the occasional crackle of Briggs's radio as he spoke in clipped tones. Renee sat perfectly still, not a muscle twitching. She looked like a statue in the back seat, composed, unyielding. But Jenkins could see it in her eyes. There was something deeper than anger there, something bigger than the traffic stop. As the patrol car pulled into the parking lot of the station, Jenkins's stomach clenched. He could already see the disdain in Briggs's eyes as he opened the door, slamming it behind him. Renee was pulled, shoved into the station and led down the hallway. Jenkins stayed behind, watching, wrestling with his thoughts. He couldn't stand by. The truth was, he was scared. Scared of what speaking out would cost him, scared of losing his job, his career. But more than that, he was scared of the world he was helping to maintain. A world where someone like Renee could be treated as less than human simply because she didn't follow the unspoken rules that men like Briggs had created. His hand hovered over the radio. He wanted to call the supervisor, report what he had seen, make it right. But he hesitated, unsure if it would even make a difference. The system protected the corrupt. Would his report even matter? That night, as Jenkins sat in the empty break room, his mind replayed the events over and over. The look in Renee's eyes, steady and unwavering, even as Briggs had dragged her into the station. The way she refused to break, even when she knew. It might make things worse. Renee had no idea he was thinking about her, but in a way she had awakened something inside him, a sense of justice he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Jenkins knew what he had to do. But as the clock ticked past, midnight, and the silence of the station settled around him, he realized it was going to take more than just him speaking up. He would have to make a choice that would change everything. As the door to the holding cell clanged shut behind Renee, her breathing slowed, but the fire inside her didn't die. She had been through far worse than this, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially Officer Briggs, decide her fate. But as the lights of the station flickered, her thoughts weren't just on herself. She thought of the countless others who had been silenced, overlooked, or crushed by the very system that was meant to protect them. She knew she couldn't back down, not now, not ever. Her fight was for more than just herself, and it had only just begun. What happens next? Stick with us as we dive deeper into the showdown that not only changed Renee's life, but brought Officer Briggs to face his worst nightmare. Don't miss the rest of the story. Subscribe now. The cold reality of the holding cell. The calm before the storm. Renee sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, her back pressed against the hard metal bench. The sharp, metallic scent of the room clung to her, mingling with the stale air and faint odor of cleaning supplies. The lights above flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the walls. Every second felt like an eternity, but in this silence she could think clearly. The cuffs were tight around her wrists, and the dull ache was a constant reminder of how far things had escalated. But what stung more than the physical discomfort was the knowledge that she was being punished for standing up, for challenging the system that had been in place for far too long. She knew exactly how this would play out in the media, how Officer Briggs would spin the story. He would paint her as the aggressor, the one who wouldn't follow the rules, the one who was difficult to control. But that wasn't the truth. She wasn't resisting authority. She was resisting abuse of power. Her military training had prepared her for many things: grueling operations, high-stakes missions, long nights of uncertainty. But this was different. She had fought battles in far more dangerous places, but those were clear-cut. Those had clear lines of right and wrong. This was a battle of perception, a fight against a system that allowed men like Briggs to thrive. But she wasn't going to be silenced. She exhaled slowly, the steady rhythm of her breath calming the rising tide of frustration inside her. She couldn't let the situation break her. The door to the holding area creaked open, breaking her thoughts. She looked up to see Briggs standing in the doorway, his face still wearing that same smug expression from earlier. But there was something different now. A shift in the air. A flicker of something that wasn't quite confidence. "Comfy?" He asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Renee didn't respond, her gaze unwavering as she stared at him from across the room. Her jaw tightened, but she refused to let him see the anger simmering beneath the surface. He was just trying to provoke her. Briggs stepped closer to the bars, his stance arrogantly leaning against the cold metal. "You know," he continued, his voice low, "if you'd just kept your mouth shut, none of this would have happened. We could have avoided all this trouble." Renee's lips curled into a small smile, her eyes never leaving his. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice soft but sharp. "I wasn't trying to avoid trouble, I was trying to make sure that there's justice, that people like you understand that you're not untouchable." Briggs froze, a brief flicker of uncertainty passing across his face. He opened his mouth to say something, but then stopped as if the words had been caught in his throat. He didn't like that. "Is that so?" he sneered, straightening up. "Well, you're going to regret this. Trust me." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Renee with only her thoughts and the rhythmic hum of the station around her. But this time, the feeling wasn't fear. It was resolve. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else decide her fate. She would fight no matter what it cost. The tipping point. The lies begin to unravel. The next few hours dragged on, and with each passing minute, the weight of the situation grew heavier. Renee knew she couldn't stay in that holding cell forever. The real fight was just beginning, and she was determined to make sure that the truth came out. But as she sat there, stewing in frustration, a new voice entered the scene. Officer Jenkins. He was still relatively new on the force, young, eager, but with a conscience that hadn't yet been dulled by the system. He had watched from a distance as Briggs dragged Renee into the station. He had seen it all, the unnecessary force, the way Briggs had spoken to her, the condescending attitude that made her seem like a criminal simply for questioning him. Jenkins had stayed silent. But that silence was beginning to eat away at him. He had worked with Briggs for a while, and he knew his partner's habits. Briggs had a reputation for being aggressive, for bending the rules. But what he had seen that night was something else entirely. The way Renee had stood her ground, unbroken, calm, even when faced with the full weight of Briggs's aggression, had planted a seed in Jenkins's mind. He couldn't keep quiet any longer. He had to act. As he sat in the small break room, nervously stirring his coffee, his mind raced. He knew how powerful Briggs was, how the system was built to protect him, but that didn't make it right. He had to make a choice. Would he stand by or would he take a stand? Jenkins knew this wasn't just about one woman in a holding cell. This was about a broken system, a system that allowed men like Briggs to run unchecked, abusing their power, their badges with no consequences. But if he spoke up, if he told someone what he had seen, he could lose everything. His career, his reputation, everything. But as he thought about it, he realized that he didn't have a choice anymore. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number of the Internal Affairs hotline. His hands shook as he pressed the number in, the weight of his decision sinking in. He couldn't let this go. The weight of justice. The truth comes to light. The next morning, Renee sat in the courthouse dressed in a sharp navy blazer, her posture erect, her gaze unwavering. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. She knew she had the truth on her side, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. As the courtroom filled with people, Renee stood tall beside her attorney, Carla Whitman, who had been quietly flipping through legal documents, her sharp eyes scanning every page. Renee could feel the tension in the air, but she didn't let it show. She wasn't intimidated. Not anymore. The door swung open and Officer Briggs walked in, his stiff gait and tight jawline betraying his nerves. His once confident swagger was now replaced with hesitation. His eyes scanned the room but didn't linger on Renee. He knew the truth was coming for him. The judge, Judge Kirkland, an older man with a reputation for being no-nonsense, entered the room and sat behind the bench. He glanced over the case files before him, his weary eyes scanning the details. "Let's get to it," the judge said, not wasting any time. The prosecutor began laying out the facts, presenting the damning bodycam footage, which caught the entire arrest on tape. The evidence was clear, undeniable. It was over for Briggs. As the footage played, Renee didn't need to watch. She had already lived it. The way Briggs had escalated the situation, the unnecessary force he used, the disrespect he had shown her. It was all there. The silence in the room was deafening. Judge Kirkland didn't mince words when he slammed the gavel. Charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are dismissed. Sergeant Briggs, you violated protocol and your actions will be investigated. Briggs's face flushed, his fists clenched. His world was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But for Renee, this was only the beginning. The truth had won. The fight wasn't over, but the first battle had been won. She had stood tall, refused to back down, and now the world would know the truth. The aftermath. Standing strong, changing the system. The courtroom doors swung open and Renee Dawson stepped out, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. She didn't look back at Officer Briggs, who was still sitting there, staring at the gavel that had sealed his fate. The silence in the room felt oppressive, but for Renee, it was a sound of victory. She had won, but it wasn't the kind of victory most people imagined. It wasn't the applause, the cheers, or the headlines that mattered. It was the fact that she had stood up for what was right, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or treated unfairly by a system that wasn't designed to protect them. As she walked down the hallway, Renee felt the weight of the battle begin to lift off her shoulders. She knew this wasn't the end. The fight was far from over. There were still so many who had been mistreated, overlooked, and abused by those in power. But today she had made a difference. Today she had spoken out, and for the first time in a long while she felt like her voice mattered. Her phone buzzed. In her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her attorney, Carla Whitman. The media is going wild about the case. They're calling it a turning point. The department is already under pressure to address the issues raised. Renee smiled to herself. It wasn't about the media frenzy or the recognition. It was about the bigger picture. This was the moment when things started to shift, when the people who had been too scared to speak up found the courage to do so. And it was all because she hadn't backed down. As Renee left the courthouse, her mind wandered to Officer Jenkins, the young officer who had been there that night. The one who had stayed quiet at first, but whose conscience had eventually led him to do the right thing. She knew his decision to speak up wasn't easy, but she also knew it had taken more courage than anything she had seen that night. Jenkins wasn't just following orders anymore. He was following his own sense of right and wrong, and that was something she deeply respected. She thought about the ripple effect of his actions. A man with integrity could inspire others. Maybe, just maybe, Jenkins's choice to stand up would encourage others to do the same, even in the face of a system that often seemed designed to protect the wrong people. Renee's mind shifted to her family, her mother, her siblings, the people who loved her. They had always been her foundation. Her strength had come from the quiet, powerful love and belief they had in her. They had been waiting for her at home, and as she thought about them, a sense of peace washed over her. They had been through so much together, and now, this victory was theirs too. She had fought for her reputation, but also for the world they would inherit. Later that afternoon, as Renee sat in a quiet cafe, sipping her coffee and scrolling through the updates on her phone, a message from the mayor's office popped up. "We would like to recognize your bravery in the upcoming community meeting. Your actions have inspired many, and we believe it's time to acknowledge your courage publicly." Renee shook her head with a small laugh, remembering how ironic it was. Bravery, she thought. She didn't feel brave. She had simply done what she knew was right, but she wasn't going to turn down the recognition either. Maybe it would help push the conversation even further. Maybe it would force people to confront the uncomfortable truths they'd been ignoring for far too long. Her thoughts were interrupted by a call from her captain. "Renee, how are you feeling?" the captain asked, his voice steady and professional, but with a warmth that made Renee feel like he was actually asking how she was holding up. "I'm doing fine, sir. Actually, I'm doing better than fine," Renee replied, her voice firm but with a hint of pride she couldn't suppress. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been silenced." The captain's voice softened. "You did what needed to be done, and now it's time to change things, one step at a time." As she ended the call, Renee looked out the window at the city moving past. Her city. The world felt different now. Not because she had beaten the system, that wasn't what this was about, but because she had started a conversation. She had ignited something in others, a fire that was now burning stronger than ever. Her story, the story of that night, would be told again and again. It would be shared in classrooms, in boardrooms, in the streets, because it wasn't just the story of a woman who refused to back down against a corrupt officer. It was the story of a system that needed to change, a story of courage, resilience, and hope. And Renee Dawson? She wasn't done yet. She wasn't finished until every voice that had been oppressed found a way to be heard, until every person who had been made to feel small could stand tall, just as she had. As she stood up to leave, Renee's phone buzzed again. Another message from her attorney. "They're already talking about your case in other precincts. Internal Affairs is reviewing all of Briggs's previous stops. This is bigger than just him." Renee smiled. The fight was far from over. But, for the first time in a long time, she knew they were winning. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone. And that was only the beginning.